Long Live Mortal Kombat Round 1 is a deep dive into the first four Mortal Kombat games, the evolution of the Mortal Kombat fandom, and many other stories just about those games and the community that spawned up around them. It's a really awesome book. David does such an awesome job of just gathering all this information, condensing it down, and turning it into a very dense but very entertaining book. The book follows the development of Mortal Kombat 1, 2, 3, Ultimate 3, and 4. There are many other stories about individuals and events in this, but they're all tied together by Mortal Kombat. It's a very interesting read, but it can be a bit daunting just because it's 550 pages, and if you've ever read one of David Craddock's books, there's a lot in here, and he gets very into the details at times. This one seems a bit different from his other books because there's just more stories about what's going on. There's more development stuff. He talks a lot more about just how the games are made. He talks to a lot of basically experts on how different glitches in the game work, when they were discovered in the arcade games, and also later on when you get into like YouTube and that sort of thing, when the code was made more accessible to people. You have people explaining why those tactics and glitches from the arcade games, why they worked, how you can do them, and yeah, it's really awesome to read and just hear all the different stuff that went into making these games. Similar to when I read Warren Davis's book about creating Q*bert, I found the live-action parts to be the most interesting. So if you're not familiar with the first three Mortal Kombat games, they actually filmed different actors, but martial artists doing all of the moves for them, and then digitized that footage and put it into the video game. That's why they looked more realistic, and they looked much different from, say, Street Fighter II at the time. That they used Warren's technology and everything, because this was Midway, the same company that dealt with Q*bert in a very roundabout sort of way. And that's just kind of the cool stuff that I like. I really love like the full motion video and the digitized graphics and that sort of thing. I just really love how all that was done. Let me back up a little bit because David does do this. He explains the history and the very convoluted way that Williams, Bally, Midway, and Gottlieb all ended up becoming one company in some way, shape, or form. I think Gottlieb got split off and their rights were purchased by someone else. But all of these four companies were pinball companies in Chicago. And over the course of just the history of Chicago pinball, these four companies would become one. The brands would then get kind of split off in different ways. And during the late 80s and the early 90s, all of these were kind of under one umbrella. You'll see that come back up later when, after Acclaim published the first two Mortal Kombat games on console, the next ones were done by Williams, which was Midway's in-house game developer / publishing label. They were the ones that would do the arcade ports. That all gets explained in here and whatnot. One thing that they did talk about that I thought was very interesting was when they were filming everything, they were using blue screen technology. This was something I had heard about before, but I'm more familiar with green screen. It's the same principle and everything, but it has... So what I've been able to figure out, it has to do with just the way digital cameras record footage. It's easier to kind of do the overlays and add more footage onto them when you're doing green screen instead of blue screen with a digital camera. I don't know if that's a universal thing. I do know that blue screens are still used today in Hollywood, but for the most part, green screens seem to have replaced them. It was kind of a rabbit hole that I fell down while I was going through this and just looking stuff up. I also have one thing that I didn't know where to put it, so I shoved it in with the development stuff. But it was talking about X-Band. X-Band was a modem that was used for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis so that you can bring video games online. Playing online wasn't really a thing, or at least it wasn't really done in the 90s for home console. PC is a different beast entirely, but for the home console, you didn't really have a chance to do that. So the X-Band let you do this. And there's a little bit in here about Mortal Kombat being played on the X-Band. The way it worked was it was just another add-on, kind of like the Game Genie or the 32X or something like that. You would plug the X-Band into the console, and then that would get hooked up to the internet through, I'm guessing, a phone line or something like that. And then your cartridge would plug into the X-Band, and then you'd be able to do like matchmaking, that sort of thing. It's a really cool idea, and I was glad David included it in here because I had no idea that this ever existed. Finding out about these weird little add-ons is always kind of just very interesting to me. And it adds on to just the overall history of the consoles and also the history of fighting games and that sort of thing. I don't know if it was exclusively fighting games that used it, but it is just one of those really awesome things. So for someone like me who did not have access to an arcade growing up and was sort of limited to the people in my neighborhood, if I had the X-Band, that would have been really cool because then, you get to play with people who also have that same console, the same X-Band, that sort of thing. I would have to look up, this would be something for like an entirely different video, looking up if there was just how the X-Band actually did everything and if there was like cross-play between the consoles and whatnot. I'd imagine it'd be kind of crazy if there was, but it would be very interesting to dig more into just how that device worked. But that is kind of beyond the scope of this video, so we'll move on to the next thing I want to talk about. For each game that is talked about in this book, we kind of dig more into that game's development, but we also talk about the reviews for the game at the time, from like the gaming press, from arcade players, and then we also get some retrospective reviews of the games. So you'll hear about Mortal Kombat 1, you'll hear about its development, you'll hear about the review scores that are given to it, and then you'll hear the arcade players, like how they discovered that game when it came out. They'll talk about where they played it, the lengths that they went to in order to play the game. And then they'll talk about just really diving into that game to figure out how to do certain things, how to discover like specific tactics and that sort of thing. It's really cool to read all of that stuff just because they go through and they're like, well, we noticed this on one of the screens where you can punch somebody with a high punch out of midair. And so we went out of our way to try to figure out how to actually do that. And then to go along with like the arcade stuff, the reaction to the arcades, the retrospectives on it have people kind of digging into the code to figure out why that happens. So why the hitbox allows you to do certain things, why some combos are able to be done, how those combos work, how you can do them, why those combos are so effective, how you would kind of break out of those combos or stop them from taking place. It's really cool to read just how into these games people have gotten. Almost not really like an obsession, but just sort of that curiosity to figure out why this game does certain things. I find that just to be incredibly fascinating. It was just so cool to read people who have such a passion for these games and to hear what they would do in order to kind of learn more about it. It was just a really awesome thing every time we got into those like several chapters about each game. And you also have people comparing, like, say, Mortal Kombat 2 to what would happen in Mortal Kombat 1, how things kind of changed in between the games. I thought that was really cool. There's quite a bit of talk about Mortal Kombat 3 and then Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. And I thought that was just very interesting. Having really not paid any attention to the arcade scene and also only being, I think, like 11 or 12 at the time, I didn't know any of this crap was going on. I was just always amazed whenever I saw a video game in the arcades because, one, I almost never went to one, and two, it was always this word of mouth thing that I would hear about, like, hey, there's a new Mortal Kombat game, and the way I would play it is usually on console. So hearing about just the different ways these things are oh gosh, that's, now that I'm talking about it, I bring up something else. So another thing that I do want to talk about are all the console ports, because those are all explained in here as well. How the games were ported to console, some of the limitations of the consoles, the stuff they had to do in order to get the game on the console. All of that's talked about in here, and it's really awesome to just sit down and read through it. I'm running into that issue where there's just so much to talk about, and I keep either forgetting things that I want to mention, or I remember something like midway through. Anyway, I really liked all of the reviews and the retrospectives that were done on each one of these games, and to just hear people who know way more about them talk about them is just really awesome. It's just a fascinating part of this entire book, and I'm really glad that David included all of it, or at least included as much as he could. This section was really interesting, to say the least. This sounds... Oh gosh, how am I going to put this? My notes on this part are just kind of an absolute mess. I'm glad that David included these stories in here. Most of them are great. Like, you hear about the relationship a lot of these martial artists had. You hear about the lengths some people went to in order to learn martial arts for this, as some of them were just filmed because they kind of resemble what the character, like the vision of the character, would be. And then you have this very, very fascinating story about Dan Pesina and how he kind of overstated his role in a lot of these games, or overstated his involvement in it, to the point where he claimed that he was one of the original creators for the game, like just the original creator of the idea for it. Yeah, it's very interesting. He was one of the actors he was one of the martial artists. He was friends of both Tobias and Boone at one point. And he gave an interview, which just kind of blows my mind that, well, it shouldn't, but it blows my mind that the video game journalist never bothered to kind of fact check any of it. But, so, to talk a little more about this, much of the criticism, sorry, let me, again, sorry, this is kind of all over the place. So, Pesina gave an interview to the video game magazine called Video Games. It's a spectacular example of gaming journalism at its worst, where, Pesina gave an interview to these people about his role in Mortal Kombat, and he overstated everything. Like, he just created stuff out of thin air. And the magazine didn't bother to reach out to anyone at Midway, or if they did, no one got back to them about it. And this was all published in their April 1994 issue of it. So Midway decided, hey, this is ridiculous. We're not going to work with this guy anymore. And then the lawsuits came in. So there were three separate lawsuits that David talks about in this. David Craddock, the author, talks about in this book. One of those lawsuits was settled out of court. It was over likeness rights because all the actors signed over their likeness rights to be used in this game. And also they were used for like merchandising and everything, which was all within Midway's right to use. They had the licenses for these people's likenesses. They were associated with these characters, and with the exception of one of them, none of these people were really like public figures. They didn't have roles in movies outside of anything. They weren't like, nobody was going to recognize them for something else, essentially. So yeah, Dan Pesina's was thrown out, and then the other three actors who kind of grouped together to do this, their lawsuits were also thrown out as well. Yeah, it's a very interesting one, and I would need a lawyer to like really go through all of this. But the way David explains it is 4 out of the 5 people that had sued just weren't well known for anything outside of, who they were. They were only really known, they were credited in the games, but they weren't known to the public as something else or by their real names. So yeah, I'm probably not explaining that very well, but it's a very, very fascinating story. I was really glad it was in here because I had no idea any of this was going on. But yeah, it's a very interesting one. There are a bunch of other stories about the different actors and martial artists in this. And I would encourage you to go read all of that stuff because I did not write everything down, did not take notes on all of that stuff. I just wanted to include this because I thought it was the most interesting of all those stories. So likes and dislikes for this book. There's so much that I love about this book. I really did enjoy just going through the whole thing, learning a lot about Mortal Kombat that I didn't know about, and just kind of hearing more about the arcade scene and arcade culture, that sort of thing. Hearing about how the games were made, the stuff that they had to do in order to get the actors in the games, that stuff is all really cool. Also hearing about the struggles with shifting into 3D with Mortal Kombat 4 was very interesting. Hearing about the other fighting games and kind of the oversaturation of the market, not just from competitors like SNK, Capcom, and just all of the other one-offs like Atari and that sort of thing. But hearing how Midway itself helped to saturate the market by publishing Killer Instinct, publishing War of the Gods, I think it was, as well as a few other games as well. That was kind of interesting to see, just how they saw this as like a cash cow that they could just keep pumping stuff out and it was all going to be great, was kind of crazy to read about. So that's another thing that I kind of liked. There are a lot of other smaller things in here that I did like, but I just didn't think were as important as some of the other stories that I mentioned. There's not a lot of dislikes in here. I couldn't really find anything that I could say I don't like that or something else along those lines. I guess I would say I didn't like that it stopped at 4 because I wanted the book to keep going, but I think there's going to be a sequel because he probably has a whole lot of information on the other ones too, and we kind of cut off at 4 and then just sort of moved on to other stuff. So maybe there'll be some other stuff. I just can't really think of anything that I really dislike about this. So, what are my final thoughts on this? Like David's other books, there is so much in here that I could say there are honestly too many stories to really accurately summarize everything in this book. I feel like I forgot a bunch of stuff, and I probably did. Even while I was recording this, I kept remembering more stories that I might want to try to fit in here somewhere. The same thing happened when I was trying to write the blog post for this one. I just kept remembering more stuff that I kind of wanted to get in. The X-Band was one of those where I was like, well, where do I put this, and that sort of thing. While I was reading this book, I wanted to try a lot of the various ports of Mortal Kombat, so I kind of went out and I found a few of them, especially on Game Boy, because I had a lot of the console ports already. And that's one thing that David's books do, is they make me want to go and try certain things, or kind of gives me a spark for those, for like my old collecting retro video games. These books are just a lot of fun to go through. Now that I've read several of David's books, if I was going to come up with like a top list of David Craddock books, this would be pretty close to the top. I'm guessing Monsters in the Darkness would be number 1, and then this one would probably come in number 2, and then his book on Quake would probably be number 3. At this point, I'm just trying to fill time. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and hey, let me know what your favorite Mortal Kombat game was. I'll talk to you all later. Bye.